Hi, good evening. My name's Christina Texera. I'm an attorney with the California Civil Rights Department. And this evening, in this room and in this virtual room, we are going to talk about the rights of LGBTQ plus people across lots of different areas. So we have a ton of information to get through. I've set a timer for myself because I like to talk. So I will try to keep to my time, but we have a lot to cover, so we're going to get into it. Because I am a lawyer, I will start with the lawyerly disclaimer that we are not creating any laws or policies tonight, and I'm not providing any legal advice. Today is April 6th. It's like 5:30. The information you are getting is accurate as of this red hot minute, but the law is a living thing and changes. So, I can project, so apologies to folks in the virtual room if you get a loud pop. But we all need to be aware of changes in the law. We are all responsible for that, although you can always look to the Civil Rights Department for updates. So a couple of important reminders, and I've mentioned this already. We have a ton to get through, and this is an overview because I want to give you as much information as possible, and then you can dig in later on into what is of most interest to you. So I like to keep things interactive. I'm going to ask some questions. Folks here in the real room, feel free to respond. Feel free to raise your hand, give me nods of the head. And folks in the virtual room, you get a free pass to be wrong or right, and no one will know. But also, we're talking about heavy stuff today, so please do stay engaged, but take care of yourself. So what that means is if you need to take a break, you hear a particular example or something that's triggering, that's difficult, take a break. Take care of yourself. Lastly, you can absolutely contact us at the Civil Rights Department to get a copy of all of these materials. Now, there'll be an hour and 5 minutes where I'll be chatting with everybody, giving information, and then we'll go sort of off the air and have an opportunity for questions and answers here in the room. So a little bit of some learning agreements for that Q&A portion. Trust and the intent with which someone asks a question or shares their experience, right? The intent here is to learn, right? To dig into some of these things. But we need to acknowledge impact. It's not enough to not intend to hurt somebody, right? We need to also acknowledge that impact. So we will try to keep that balance. Take space, make space. One mic, one diva. There's lots of ways of saying this, right? If you're a person who shares and talks a lot, be aware of that. Maybe give other folks an opportunity. If you're someone who maybe does not pipe up a lot, feel free, because this is absolutely a for learning. And the Q&A, like I mentioned, is not recorded. We want folks here in the room to feel comfortable being candid. And so I'm asking you, though, in the spirit of that, anything you hear here today that is really specific to someone's circumstances, or maybe they share the name of a person or a business, leave that stuff here. But what you learn about the law and how to apply it. So that's a lot of housekeeping. Let's get into what we're going to talk about. We're going to cover a ton of different areas of civil rights. I will talk to you a little bit about the Civil Rights Department. We'll talk about employment and housing rights under the Fair Employment and Housing Act. We'll talk about discrimination at businesses. We'll talk about a law that we enforce covering hate violence. And lastly, I'll highlight some resources from the Civil Rights Department, because although I am very glad to be here with you, we can't be with you all the time. So we want you to be able to access some. So a little bit quickly about the California Civil Rights Department. Our mission is to protect the people discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodations, and from hate violence and human trafficking. Now, you might be more familiar with us under our previous name, the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. We changed our name just about 2 years ago. But as you can see from the mission statement, the name change is a good one and fits. Certainly, we do so much more than just housing and employment. So some of our responsibilities, you probably are most familiar with us as investigating civil rights complaints of discrimination. Part of us doing that is trying to help the parties work it out, and we call that facilitating dispute resolution. Sometimes, but rarely, we also can prosecute civil rights violations in court. Our department also issues regulations that help to clarify the laws that we enforce. Now, laws, statutes, those are things written by and passed by legislators. That's not us over at CRD. But different departments, they complete what's called regulations. And what those regulations do is they explain the law. They explain that statute, that law passed by the legislature. Right? We as a department are in a better position to know how to operationalize some of these things. So we do that as well. We also collect the pay data of large employers. That pay data reporting period is coming up really quickly in May. So definitely do take a look at our website if you are an employer with 100 or more employees. We do what I'm doing right now. We conduct outreach and education to help folks understand their rights and obligations. And we have a really, really unique unit as well at the Civil Rights Department called the Community Conflict Resolution Unit. They work exclusively with communities that are experiencing some kind of community-wide impact because of discriminatory practices. So a really, really unique offering that we have. Our ability to do any of what was just on that last slide depends on us meeting people where they are. And so on that note, we absolutely do provide accommodations to folks with disabilities to participate in any part of our process. And we do the same for folks who feel most comfortable speaking in languages other than English or who do not speak any English. So we can provide folks with interpretive, spoken, or translation, written services. All right, that's the Civil Rights Department in a nutshell. Like now we're gonna get into some of the meat and potatoes, but I wanna lay some foundation for those meat and potatoes first. Now, I feel as though, I'm in the room here with a lot of well-versed folks who are perhaps part of the community, and I'm guessing the same is true of the folks in our virtual room. But for anyone who is not, want to just lay some foundation of terminology for us. I won't go through all of these. I do want to make, though, a really, really specific point here, that we are going to look later on at these same words, but how they're defined in the law. So the way that we use words in our everyday speak sometimes does not translate over to the law. So it may be a little bit different, and we'll go ahead and point those out and uplift those. I know there's been a lot of changes at the federal level that has folks asking questions or concerned. The only thing I want to say about that on this slide is that California does continue to provide an X on people's driver's licenses, folks who identify as non-binary. I think I used the word dead name in this presentation once, so that is one that maybe folks don't know. It's referring to a transgender person or gender nonconforming person's name they were given at birth. May be different, is different if you're dead naming someone from the name that they go by now. And again, legal definitions might be at odds with our everyday speak. So just be aware of that. Definitely don't feel like you got to memorize any of this stuff. And if you are a person who serves the community and you're not sure about what terminology to use, go to community resources. Look at other LGBTQ glossaries, right? Going to a source that is not directly the source, that is not directly the folks engaged in the community using the language, is a way to set yourself up for failure, right? There's no better expert on lived experience than the people living that experience. So I did mention this distinction, this difference between state and federal law that we at the Civil Rights Department have been asked a lot about. And so the way that I describe this is like a house, right? We build the foundation of a house first, we build the walls, right? We put on a roof. You can think about the federal law as the foundation of that house. Absolutely have to have that solid foundation there. It's the floor, the absolute minimum of legal protections that a person can get. That federal law creates the floor for us. I have an example here that disability discrimination is protected by federal law. We also protect that, but that means that minimally us and every other state have to protect against disability discrimination. Now, state law builds upon that floor. We can't go any lower. We're not going into the basement, right? We're not taking anyone's rights away, but we can build upon those rights that are given. So an example here rather, is that California protects people that have criminal histories when they're seeking housing or employment. Federal law doesn't cover that, but we do as California, right? Other states may not either. And then local law is that roof, right? It's the absolute, it's the tippy top of the house, right? Can build on the foundation, can build on the walls, can't take any less though. So we can keep building up those protections, but can't ever dip below that federal level. What does this mean for us practically? Cute picture of the house. Yeah, what does that mean? Well, that means that we here in California have rights that are given to us by the state. So that means that the federal government, if they reduce rights, if they take rights away in any areas, is not going to impact us here in California. So business as usual here in our state. But that's a really, really important concept for us to build upon. All right, so now we're going to get into the Fair Employment and Housing Act. So this is where we're going to find all of the civil rights information that we need about housing and employment right there in the title. I'm going to call it FEHA because that's also a real mouthful. So what does FEHA say? Well, it prohibits discrimination and harassment based on protected characteristics. We're going to talk about what that term means in just a minute. It also prohibits retaliation. We're going to define that term as well. FEHA also requires that employers and housing providers give reasonable accommodations to folks with disabilities and with sincerely held religious beliefs. The magic number for employers tends to be 5 with FEHA, right? 5 employees or more. There is a very important exception for harassment, and we'll get into that. Lastly, like I mentioned, right, federal law, state law, local law. The state, essentially these are the state counterparts to the federal law, the Civil Rights Act and also the Fair Housing Act. We just combine those two things together here in the state and we look at them together. Something important to note about FEHA is that it protects your actual characteristics, who you are, right, your race, your sex, your sexual orientation, your gender identity, your gender expression, but it also covers your perceived protected characteristics, what someone believes you are. Essentially, the law does not want to make it okay for people to discriminate just because they're wrong about who they're discriminating against. It also covers association, which is kind of just what it sounds like. If you associate with someone in a particular protected class, has protected characteristics, then you are covered by FEHA as well. So I won't go through all of these. A couple of things, though, that I definitely want to uplift. These are protected in both employment and housing. Employment and housing each have more protected characteristics that are different. So we'll look at those in just a minute. But as you can see from this list, these are things about people or a group of people that make up their identity. That's something very close to who they are. Maybe it's even inextricable, can't be taken apart from who they are. So again, the actual characteristics a person has, the perceived characteristics, and also their association. I mentioned a little bit earlier that, our everyday speak sometimes is not the same as how the law defines things. Disability and medical condition are one of those areas. The way that we use the term medical condition in our everyday speak is not the same way that the law defines it. Medical condition is defined really, really specifically and refers specifically to a history of having cancer or having genetic characteristics that could cause cancer. Really specific, wildly specific. So just be aware, again, that you do not need to be a legal expert to file a complaint with the California Civil Rights Department. As an example, we will help you work some of this stuff out. But if you believe you've been discriminated against, you can file a complaint And you can list as many of these as you think apply to your circumstance. So I want to roll forward to just to flash up on screen the additional protected characteristics for employment and housing. The piece of this that I want to uplift is that age discrimination in employment means 40 or older, not the same in housing. So just be aware, there's a little bit more of a limitation there when we're looking at employment. And again, perceived, actual, or association with folks. This is where I was mentioning too that the law defines things differently than how we may use them in our everyday speak. So certainly, these are all protected characteristics that show up. Transgender itself is not a protected characteristic, but it does fall under gender expression or gender identity, right? So again, the way that we use some of these terms and what we might think would show up in a complaint really may be a little bit different. So we know that FEHA, right? We read a list, right? Discrimination, harassment, retaliation, but what do those things mean? What do they actually mean? So we're going to lay some foundation here with some definitions. We're going to get into some examples. So when we're talking about the Fair Employment and Housing Act and we're talking about discrimination, we're talking about treating a person differently, at least in part, because they have one or more, of those protected characteristics that we just talked about. So again, treating someone differently or unfairly because of those things. Harassment is unwelcome words or conduct that demean a person, that threatens them or intimidates them. It may even have an impact on their personal sense of safety. And when we talk about retaliation, we're talking about unfair treatment because a person did something they have a legal right to do. We call that engaging in legally protected activity. The because piece in retaliation is the most important one. Right? We have to know that the legally protected activity came before that harm. So we have laid now a foundation for understanding the Fair Employment and Housing Act, FEHA. We know what standards are there. We know what discrimination, harassment, and retaliation mean. We've seen the differences in the protected bases. So now let's dig in. Let's dig into some of these areas. So how might discrimination look at work for folks who are part of the LGBTQ plus community? Maybe it's an outright refusal to hire anybody who's part of the community. Maybe it's firing someone because they refuse to wear a uniform that isn't consistent with their gender expression. Maybe it's an undeserved negative evaluation based on a person's association with a colleague who's non-binary. Forcing someone to use a particular bathroom is also discrimination. And excluding a transgender employee from certain job perks or events. Those are all examples of how discrimination may come up at work. It is not exhaustive, though. That's not the end-all, be-all of examples. Now let's talk about harassment, right? Those unwelcome words or conduct. How might that look at work? Well, it might look like teasing or jokes about a person's gender transition or their name change. It could look like physically blocking somebody from their workstation, sexually explicit graffiti in bathrooms, the use of racial slurs, or hiding or interfering with a person's assistive device. We know that there tend to be high rates of disability in the LGBTQ plus community, so you'll see some disability examples also weaved in here. All of these things would be harassment at work. A couple more things about harassment. I mentioned it an exception to that magic number 5 with FEHA. This is that exception. FEHA says that no employers of any size can harass their employees. So even if an employer has less than 5 employees and may not need to comply with the other parts of FEHA, they have to stop retaliation if it happens or prevent it from happening. Now, I want to highlight a California Supreme Court case from the last few years because it really changed how we define a hostile work environment. And I'm sure a bunch of us have heard that phrase or that term before. But what does that actually mean? What makes a work environment hostile? So when harassment is severe, really bad, or pervasive, happens a lot, and has a negative impact on that person's job, that's a hostile work environment. So it's got to be an or. It's got to be pervasive or really bad and impact their work environment. Now, the difference in this California Supreme Court case was that they said the one-time use of an unambiguous racial slur was enough. That's a huge departure from the law. You used to have to show that it was really, really bad, really egregious, or that it happened a lot. The standard now is one time the use of an unambiguous racial slur. That does not mean that it can't be extended to other protected bases or protected characteristics, but this is a pretty big change in the law, so I want to make sure to talk about that. Also, when we're thinking about liability for harassment, this is, for the employers in the room, if it's a supervisor who's engaged in the harassment, the employer is going to be legally responsible. Right? You've put that person in charge. You've given them a certain amount of authority. Now, if it's a coworker or a third party, maybe this is a public-facing business and you have clients or customers come in, an employer is going to be legally responsible for harassment that happens if they knew about it or if they should have known about it and they failed to take appropriate action. Appropriate action is really, really important there. Not just action. Right? You guys knock it off. If that's not calculated to actually stop the harassment, that's not appropriate action. So it really does have to be some kind of way to really stop or interrupt that harassment, or that liability is going to stick with you as an employer. So a quick knowledge check for us. We're going to talk about Julio. Julio works at a factory. He's gay, but he's never come out at work. His coworkers use gay slurs, they make vulgar comments about his sex life, and they also make kissy noises when he walks by their stations. Feeling humiliated and unable to focus on work, Julio complains to his supervisor, who tells the workers to stop joking around on the job. However, the conduct continues. So what do we think, right? We just learned about discrimination and harassment and retaliation. So let's think about Julio's experience here for a moment. It might raise multiple things for us. You can see up on the screen that we're thinking about multiple issues that might have happened. So everyone's marinating on it, right? You're thinking about it, you're formulating your ideas. Now, this is adapted from a real case. It's not Julio didn't work at a factory, but this absolutely happened to someone. And it does probably likely constitute a hostile work environment, right? Think about that. Unwelcome words or conduct that demeans a person, maybe causes them to question their personal sense of safety at work. So those kinds of comments, that constant harassment, the kissy noises, all of those things, right, may be pervasive, happen a lot. Sexual harassment, right, there's unwelcome conduct based on Julio's sexual orientation. The point that I want to make here, though, that's really important is that sexual harassment does not have to be motivated by sexual desire. None of his coworkers have to want to have sex with Julio to be liable to have engaged in sexual harassment. Certainly discrimination, right? There might be some discrimination there. We might want to know more, right? That supervisor's failure to take appropriate corrective action, right? And just the finger wag, that could be discrimination, right? Especially if you look at how other complaints are handled. If other complaints are handled more seriously than this particular complaint, that may very well be evidence of discrimination. And certainly the employer's efforts to stop the harassment failed, right? We know there was one comment, you guys knock it off, but we know that it didn't work because we know the harassment kept happening. So it gives you an idea of how some of these things might pop up at work and how you then might think about, with what we've just learned about FIHA, what might have happened, which of your rights may have been violated. So now let's talk about retaliation. Remember, that is punishing an employee for something they have a legal right to do. So some examples of how that might come up at work: firing someone because, and remember that because is really, really important, because they file a CRD complaint. Well, you absolutely have a legal right to file a CRD complaint. Maybe harassing an employee because they complained that they witnessed discrimination. Absolutely have a legal right to complain about witnessing discrimination. Giving an employee an undeserved negative performance review because they cooperated with an EEO or an HR investigation at work, right? Also something that people have a legal right to do. Maybe, and this one does come up, for our community often, is disciplining someone because they refuse to follow instructions that would cause them to violate someone else's rights. Right? Well, you have to make that person use that bathroom. Well, I'll break California law if I do that. That person's punished. Might be retaliation there. So I want to do another knowledge check with us, and I want to talk about Jazz. Jazz works for a city in the basement records room with one other person named Jill. One day, Jill sees a mouse, and she tells Jazz. Jazz yelps, and she jumps on her chair, totally freaked out. Jill laughs and says, "Oh, you dykes scare so easy." Jazz immediately, their eyes well up with tears, and they leave the room. They confide in two coworkers about what happened. Now, Jazz knows that the HR representative at the city, Fran, her and Jill are good friends. But after consideration, Jazz decides, I'm going to report the incident. This was not okay. In the meantime, Jazz and Jill are still working really closely together. A month later, HR Representative Fran still hasn't filed a formal complaint, despite that being the city policy. So now Jazz is waiting, doesn't know what's going on. Jazz eventually requests a meeting to get an update on the status of their complaint. Now at the meeting, Fran tells Jazz that there is not going to be an investigation, adding that Jazz telling other workers about the incident might have actually created a hostile work environment for Jill because people might think that she's homophobic. So turns it around a bit there on Jazz. After this meeting, anytime Jazz sees Fran is jeering at her or rolling her eyes. At Jazz's next performance review, they get an uncharacteristically low mark because they're irritable and distracted at work. Now, Jazz says that she's got trouble. Jazz is she, they. Sorry, I should have mentioned. Jazz says that she's got trouble doing work because of the stress of being accused of creating a hostile work environment. Right now, Jazz is kind of tiptoeing around the workplace, feeling fearful. So let's think about this in terms of retaliation, because there's a lot to unpack here. There's a lot going on in a very, very short period of time. Now, that California Supreme Court case that I mentioned, the one-time use of the racial slur, it's this case. It was the use of the N-word, and it happened in the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. Anyone can get this wrong. That is the point that I am making. Literally anyone can get it wrong. So let's unpack some of that retaliation that we saw. What about what protected activity, right? We know we have to do something that we've got a legal right to do. Well, reporting Jill's use of that slur, right? That's the protected activity. And did Jazz experience harm? Yes, in a bunch of different ways. First off, not being able to access the HR process. Right? There was never any investigation done at all. Now, the way that I approached this when I was practicing, and I think this still tends to be true, is that I would look for the policy, and then did you follow the policy? Right? Deviation from process, deviation from policy is the birthplace of discrimination. You got a policy, use your policy. Use it the same for everyone, because there's liability hidden in there, even if sometimes you don't take that step back and look at what's going on. Now, what about that evidence, though? How does Jazz prove that, right? How would we think about that? Well, Fran didn't follow the policy, right? We know that deviation from that could be evidence, certainly. Fran threatened Jazz and intimidated her by saying, well, actually, you are creating a hostile work environment. She jeered at her, she rolled her eyes at her whenever they saw each other, and then Jazz got that out of the ordinary negative evaluation. All of those things are persuasive evidence that retaliation happened. Now, since we're on the subject of work, I want to dig into some regulations. Remember, those are things that our department drafts to help explain the law. We put out some regulations in 2019 that get right into the heart of some of the employment issues that people see the most. So first up is name and pronouns at work. Employees in California have the right to be addressed by the name or pronouns corresponding to their gender identity or expression, regardless of whether they have gone through that formal name change process. There are very few exceptions, and it essentially has to do with reporting to the federal government or some kind of identifying body, right? Like filing taxes, issuing a W-2, right? Something like that. Now, when we look, we're going to roll through a couple of slides that sort of look like this. You'll see some bolded parts of those slides. That's the quick and dirty of it. That's the takeaway. So the takeaway here is that failing to use the correct name or pronouns of someone at work could absolutely rise to the level of harassment and discrimination. So intentionally or repeatedly dead naming or misgendering someone, or a supervisor requiring a person to wear a name tag with their dead name because that's what's on your paperwork. Now, what if a person refuses to call their coworker by the correct pronouns due to their own sincerely held religious belief? What happens then? Well, remember some of those retaliation examples we talked about? Can't be forced to do something illegal. Well, the same is true. The opposite is true as well. An employee can't expose their boss to liability because they want to violate someone's rights. Right? I'm going to misgender this person. I'm going to dead name this person. Right? Those things might expose an employer to liability, and employers don't have to allow that either. Now, they do have to go through a really specific process to consider any kind of reasonable accommodation. Come see me in July at a webinar on a Wednesday at 11. I'm going to talk for an hour about reasonable accommodations, and we'll get through some of those things. But again, the bottom line here is that employers are not going to be required to provide accommodations that might expose them to liability. But it's, again, a very, very specific analysis. Come chat with me if you're concerned about that as an employer. Bathrooms, certainly this we see in the news. Employees absolutely have the right to use the bathroom corresponding to their gender identity or expression, and that's regardless of their sex assigned at birth. The takeaway here, again, that bolded statement, right? Failing to allow employees to use the bathroom of their choosing could be harassment or discrimination. So employers have, they've got some policies they need to think about, and think about those things on the front end. Do not wait until this happens at your place of business. Clothing and appearance, certainly also something that we get a lot of questions about. Employees have the right to dress and groom themselves according to their gender identity and gender expression. So certainly employers sometimes may have safety reasons for establishing a dress code. They may have other reasons for establishing a dress code, but they cannot enforce that in a way that's discriminatory. They got to treat everybody the same. If one person's allowed to wear makeup, everybody's allowed to wear makeup, right? That's kind of a quick way that you can think about it. So importantly, for transgender folks, for non-binary folks, for folks who are gender non-conforming, can't be held to a different standard than the other folks there. Inappropriate questions. This comes up with supervisors, but also with coworkers, especially if someone is transitioning at the workplace. So employers should not ask questions about employees' bodies or their genitalia or their gender transition history. These are things I have to say out loud, truly. So some examples of questions that would be inappropriate. Do you plan to have surgery? Why'd you change your name? Are the hormones going to send you into puberty? Right? I just saw one like this in the news. Oh, well, that's going to make you so unattractive. So you got sexual harassment there as well. It's a rough one. Now, if an employee asks for medical leave because they're getting gender-affirming care, well, then that's different. That's a little bit different, right? Because that person's asking for a legally protected leave. So you got to prove that you actually qualify for that legally protected leave. But again, the takeaway here, questions that are designed to detect someone's gender transition status may very well be discrimination and harassment. Now, housing protections, this is the same, absolute same definitions as before. Just want to flash them up there to remind everybody. And what might discrimination at home look like? Refusing to rent to a person because they're transgender. A homeless shelter refusing access to a non-binary person because they don't fit on either side of that gender binary, right? Maybe they have a men's and a women's side and no room for anything else, according to them. Or not allowing a tenant's partner to move in because they're a same-sex couple. I absolutely saw that when I was in practice. What might harassment look like at home? So FEHA, in the same way that we've talked about with employment, housing providers, they have to intervene if they see some kind of harassment happening, like jokes or taunting, right? Maybe it's pulling flyers down from someone's door, right? We definitely have heard issues with folks having their pride flags taken down off of their doors or their stickers being pulled off. So important to note there that housing providers have an obligation to spot and stop those things, again, in a meaningful way, right? Not just a wag of the finger or, hey, I don't deal with that here. So let's check our knowledge. We're going to talk about Nikki. Nikki's a person who's gender nonconforming. They rent an apartment in a large complex. Last week, they came home to a flyer taped to their door calling transgender and gender nonconforming people criminals. Nikki feels threatened, so they install a small doorbell camera. They again discover a flyer on their door with hateful slurs. And when they watch the video back, they see it's their neighbor, Deborah, taping the flyer to their door. And Nikki is shocked. Now, the next time Nikki sees Deborah avoids eye contact and calls Nikki a slur under her breath. Nikki's had enough. They complain to the property manager and they provide a copy of the video. And the manager responds, look, you two need to work it out like adults. I have a policy that I don't get involved with tenant drama. Right, so we just learned about this, right, and about housing providers' obligations. Nikki's really frustrated and does not know what to do next. They search the internet for resources and they come upon ye old CRD. So Nikki decides to file a complaint. Nikki's complaint's accepted, and the Civil Rights Department sends a copy of the complaint to the owner of the apartment complex and the property management company. The next day, Nikki's manager gives them a 30-day notice to move out. Nikki thinks the notice is meant to punish them for filing a complaint and causing trouble for the manager, right? The manager doesn't like to get involved in tenant drama. So, right, think again about those definitions that we've just learned. Think about those definitions and what we just learned, right? Discrimination, harassment, retaliation. There are elements of all of those here, right? Every single one of those. And again, think about that example with Julio, right? We might even want to know, how did Nikki's manager respond to other complaints of harassment, right? Did Nikki's manager do anything about that? Maybe in other circumstances they did. But if they intend to discriminate against Nikki based on their protected characteristics, that's pretty compelling evidence. That's pretty persuasive, right? Handling something differently. Sometimes we see that employers and housing providers will let other folks who work there or other tenants do that sort of dirty work for them, right? They'll allow the harassment. That does not mean they escape liability if they are not the ones committing the harassment. So we're going to move away now from the Fair Employment and Housing Act into some of the other laws that CRD enforces. And the first of those is the Ralph Civil Rights Act. So I'm going to give us a pause again for a second And again, a foundational concept. It's going to help us get into this section. And again, it's about explaining how the law operates, right? It's supposed to be easy to understand, but unfortunately, it is not always easy to understand. So, want to just talk quickly about the difference between civil laws and criminal laws, because they treat hate differently. There are differences between how the civil law, civil code, government codes, civil rights, and the penal code, the code that punishes folks and sends them to jail, right? How those things operate. So criminal hate crimes, when we're talking about crimes, criminal acts, violate the penal code, right? That's where all of the different laws are: assault, battery, right? It's enforced by police, district attorneys, and courts. So that's who's showing up. That's who's in this world, right? You don't see CRD there, right? Because we don't handle criminal law. This can result in jail or fines. Now, the civil law is a little bit different. Now, that's what we enforce. So civil hate incidents are going to violate civil law. They're enforced by state departments and courts, so no police. We're talking about these civil hate incidents. We're not getting into any law enforcement intervention. And unlike criminal law, civil law is not going to send you to jail. You're not going to become incarcerated for a violation of civil law, but you will get fines potentially. You may also have to compensate the person that was harmed. So two different areas of the law. One single action motivated by hate can violate both. But there are also acts that aren't going to violate either one. That's the tough part. That's the foundation that I wanted to lay for us, because I know that can be a pretty unsatisfying answer. There are some hate-motivated actions that are absolutely hateful, absolutely awful. Do not violate the law. Do not violate civil law. Do not violate criminal law. So it's important for us to understand these distinctions so that we know when something is happening that we might be able to act on. Now, I know this is like a little bit of a bummer part of the presentation, but I wanted to read something from the Attorney General's website because I think it's exactly right. The U.S. Constitution allows hate speech as long as it doesn't interfere with the civil rights of others. And while these acts are certainly hurtful, they do not rise to the level of criminal violations and thus may not be prosecuted. However, it is important to note that these incidents have a traumatic impact on the victims as well as on the community at large. Just because there are no laws violated does not mean there is no harm. And again, there it is in the passage that I just read. It's the First Amendment, right? That protects some of these things. But the Ralph Civil Rights Act has some responses to that. So this is Leon Ralph. He is the author of the Ralph Civil Rights Act. And what the Ralph Civil Rights Act says is that people are protected from violence and intimidation by threat of violence against either themselves or their property based on their actual or perceived protected characteristics, right? We know what actual and perceived protected characteristics mean, right? We laid that foundation for ourselves earlier. Two other parts of the Ralph Civil Rights Act that are helpful to know that tend to come up the most for us at the Civil Rights Department: making or threatening to make a false police report is now a violation, right? We remember more than a couple of years ago, but this part of the law came about after a 911 call that was made in New York. There was a bird watcher, right? So it was the legislature wanted to respond to the improper use of 911. To emergency services. So now it's actually a hate incident. If you make a false police report about somebody, knowing that it's false or with reckless disregard for the truth or falsity of it. So really a new piece of the law. Another new piece of the law, again, in response to what's been happening. This is what I mean when I say the law is a living thing. Now, something called hate littering is protected under the, or is prohibited rather, under the Ralph Civil Rights Act. And hate littering is kind of just what it sounds like. Having materials or information that you take to someone's private property without their permission and intending to terrorize them. In this case, terrorize means causing someone, a reasonable person with reasonable regular emotions, these are terms that come up in the law, right, that would cause a person reasonable fear. We're looking at the reasonable person standard. Someone in your shoes, in that circumstance, would they be afraid? That's the standard that we're looking at. So let's talk a little bit more about the Ralph Civil Rights Act. Now, I know that we talked about some of the distinctions in protected characteristics between employment and housing, right? There was that big list, and then we had a couple of boxes. We talked about employment, right? That's particular, 40 and over. Same deal here. The Ralph Civil Rights Act has its own set of protected characteristics. Now, an important piece of this, and this is in the law, and it's quoted right up there, this list of characteristics is illustrative rather than restrictive. Cute. What does that mean, though? Well, it means that this isn't a complete list. It means that the law is telling us that arbitrary discrimination is not okay. And just because we can't name every kind of arbitrary discrimination does not mean that we're going to make it okay. So that this is the law trying to be flexible and trying to respond to some of what's happening here. Now, you'll definitely see more protected characteristics here, different protected characteristics than you'll see in housing and employment. Things like political affiliation, primary language, right? Some of these things may not be covered in other areas of the law. Now, hate speech, that one comes up a lot. And I know that I spent time just a few minutes ago talking about, sometimes there are hate incidents and they don't violate any laws at all. Usually when that comes up, it's related to hate. It's a hateful thing that someone has said. Well, I mentioned there are some limits here. Hateful speech absolutely can violate the Ralph Civil Rights Act, but only when certain factors are met. So the speech itself has to threaten violence against a person or a group. The person or group that the threat is directed to reasonably fear that violence is going to be committed against them. Again, that reasonable person standard. A reasonable person standing in that person's shoes. Would they be afraid? The person threatening the violence is acting in reckless disregard for the threatening nature of their speech. They don't care that they're scaring somebody. And that person has to seemingly be able to carry out the threat. So they have to, again, reasonable person, right? A reasonable person would see and say, yeah, you have the ability to carry this out. Maybe you're across the street screaming at me, but I see that you have the ability to do that. So when these circumstances are all met, a Ralph Civil Rights Act complaint could absolutely be filed for something hateful that someone said. Now, remember Nikki, our housing knowledge check? Remember she had that nasty neighbor, Deborah? Yeah, Deborah could also be liable for a Ralph Civil Rights Act violation. Remember those posters on the door? Yeah, that's hate littering. That likely is hate littering. So there might be several layers of liability that could attach to a single incident. So some other examples might look like stopping or attempting to stop a pride march by threatening to harm people, damaging a person's personal property because of their perceived sexual orientation, putting a flyer with anti-LGBTQ messages on the doorstep of the home of a queer person to make them fear for their safety, vandalizing a building with slurs because the owners provide services to people who are LGBTQ+. So again, that association piece. Threatening to make a false police report against someone because of their gender expression, right? We just talked about this and how that came up in the law. Or assaulting someone because they're non-binary or gender non-conforming, right? Those are some examples of other Ralph Act violations. So now we're going to go into another area of law that CRD covers, and that's the UNRRA Civil Rights Act, and that applies to businesses. So businesses that are open to the public. And I've mentioned the word arbitrary, right? When we were talking about the Ralph Civil Rights Act, right? The Ralph Civil Rights Act wants to recognize that there may be arbitrary reasons that are not listed in the law, that someone may have their rights violated. The Unruh Civil Rights Act kind of takes this same spirit and protects folks from arbitrary discrimination at businesses based on their personal characteristics. And again, personal characteristics, protected bases, protected characteristics, all these kind of interchangeable terms. Again, something fundamental to a person, something that makes up who they are, their identity. And importantly, I want to lift up here that the Unruh Civil Rights Act does explicitly recognize sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex. Now, sometimes they're sort of considered under this umbrella, potentially, of gender expression, right? Like being transgender is not a box that you can check, but that's going to fall under gender identity or gender expression, or perhaps both. So we're going to talk for a moment about Sasha and Paulina, right? We know now a little bit about the Unruh Civil Rights Act and wanting to protect folks from arbitrary discrimination at businesses. So Sasha and Paulina are a queer couple getting married in a few months. Mazel tov, right? They go to a local shop, Becky's Bakery, to order a wedding cake. At first, Becky is enthusiastic about their order. However, things change when she learns that Sasha and Paulina are queer. She asks them to leave, and she says that she will not make their wedding cake. Becky adds that she has a policy against making cakes for non-traditional couples, right? That's the wording that Becky uses. This is based, again, on a case that the Civil Rights Department actually brought on someone's behalf. You can look it up online if you are inclined to do so. But I'm seeing in the virtual room, I'm seeing scowls here on the face of the people in the real room. So I think we have a good sense of whether or not Becky's Bakery violated the law. Now, does it matter that Becky said non-traditional, right? She didn't say because you're queer, because you're gender nonconforming, because you're two women, right? Whatever she would want to say, whatever her perception is. Non-traditional, right? That can be a stand-in for that. Sometimes we hear too, like, well, they're being very difficult. Sometimes that's like one of those words that gets applied to folks instead of, right, their protected characteristic. Well, you're being difficult, right? So you're going to be excluded based on being difficult. And really the being difficult is just asking for your rights to be honored, right? So that retaliation territory again. So it does not matter, right, that Becky used this sort of catch-all term, non-traditional, because what she was communicating was that it was their sexual orientation or their gender identity or their gender expression that's causing her to want to not provide them service. So in fact, Becky's Bakery, yes, did violate the law as a court found in the case that CRD filed. Now, a question that comes up for us, and it's come up more so in the last year and a half, is about gender-affirming healthcare, right? These are businesses, right? They make money. And so these are businesses open to the public. They absolutely fall under the Unruh Act, most of them. So the Unruh Act applies to most healthcare providers and includes disability as a protected characteristic. Now, the reason I want to lift up disability in particular is because I did name and gender changes for folks when I was practicing, and typically what that requires is a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, right? And then that sort of triggers the requirements in California to undergo clinically appropriate treatment. That standard changed in California back in 2012. So it's been quite some time that surgery or an affidavit from a physician is not required. So I again just want to uplift that, want to make sure too that I'm putting a fine point on disability, because certainly gender dysphoria is categorized as a disability. So what this means, practically speaking, is that people have the right to obtain treatment for children or adults for disabilities, including gender dysphoria. They have the right to schedule an appointment for gender-affirming healthcare and to receive healthcare services regardless of their gender identity, their gender expression, or their sexual orientation. Now, in a minute, we're going to talk about Government Code Section 11135. I don't have a cooler name for it. That's it. But just know, the way that we talked about Nikki and Deborah, and we learn later on, there's some Ralph liability there. Pin those in your minds, because we're going to talk about Government Code Section 11135 in just a moment and how it might apply in a healthcare situation. First, we're going to talk about Tao. Tao's a transgender man who's been taking testosterone to treat gender dysphoria for several years, and he recently got a new job and so had to change his health provider. At the first appointment with the new doctor, Dr. Jane, Tao asked Dr. Jane to start managing his testosterone prescription. Dr. Jane becomes visibly uncomfortable. She tells Tao that she's not treated transgender patients or prescribed testosterone before. She says she needs to do some research, and then she'll get back to Tao about taking over his care, including that prescription. A week later, Tao gets a letter in the mail saying Dr. Jane is no longer accepting new patients, and that Tao has got to find another healthcare provider to manage his gender dysphoria and testosterone prescriptions. Yeah, I'm seeing pursed lips here in the room and like furrowed eyebrows. I'm seeing like a lot of absolutely not. This is bad. Yeah, your instincts are absolutely right. Right? Saying, well, we're not taking new patients, right? That's not a I don't want to serve you. But a meeting that already happened, an appointment, a conversation, and then a letter saying, no, actually, I'm not accepting new patients. Seems very legitimate on the face, right? That may absolutely be something that could happen for a healthcare provider. If the reasoning, if the triggering event here is a person's protected characteristics, then that's going to be discrimination, right? That's going to be a problem. Civil Rights Department investigators might want to know, were other people signed up at that time? Other people that signed up in that same window as Tao? Did they also get bounced? Did they get a letter saying no new patients? Right? All of those things. They're not things that we would expect someone to come to the Civil Rights Department saying, well, I know exactly what all the roles say at my doctor's office. No. But if there's an indication there, you can name some of that information or evidence, and that creates a pathway for our investigators to then also look for particular information. So yes, Dr. Jane here did violate the law. Like I mentioned, we're going to talk now about Government Code Section 11135. And basically, you can think about it like our state's non-discrimination statute for anyone that gets state dollars. It's super broad. You can't do anything to discriminate against people on these bases if you get 1 red cent of state money. So it's really, really important to know what the funding sources are of some of these programs or activities, because if they receive state funding, even a little bit, then they have a lot of obligations that they may not otherwise have. So again, I mentioned 11135 protects folks from discrimination and harassment from any services, programs that are conducted, and this is a very broad net, conducted, operated, or administered by the state or using state funds. So this means grants, this means funds that the state gives directly to counties or cities to do particular things like sign people up for Medi-Cal or for food stamps. The protected characteristics, again, here also include perception, association, and again, wanting to uplift, that these terms mean different things, right? Disability, medical condition, genetic information. So just be aware of those things. And this, again, applies to state and local government. Obviously, we're all getting that money, but also to contractors, grantees, or other local agencies. So some examples of how this may come up out in the world. A community organization that receives state grants exclude gay men from their youth empowerment programs based on their sexual orientation. During an appointment to sign up for benefits, a county welfare department social worker repeatedly calls a child muchachita and tells the parent that they should cut their son's hair because he looks like a girl. That's a real example from my past life in social services. Could also look like a city recreational program that receives state funds, right? Because that's the hook here. Maybe a city recreational program refuses to allow a person to participate in a talent show unless they agree to dress corresponding to their sex assigned at birth, right? Any kinds of activities, programs that's funded by the state comes with that state requirement, that promise that you're not going to use our money in a way that's discriminatory or that excludes people or that goes contrary to the rest of the laws that we as government have to follow. So that's, I know we have just I'm a couple of minutes over, but I wanna highlight resources really quickly, because again, love being in the room with you, love being in the virtual room with you folks, but we cannot be all places at all times and all things. Now, I'm super proud of this picture in particular because these are my coworkers, like real life actual humans who we work with at CRD who are wonderful. On the far left is Becky Monroe, who has left, but we love her and we send that into the ether. But these are folks that we're working with every day that are showing up and that are really happy to do it. So first thing I want to uplift here is the California versus Hate resource line and network. This is a non-emergency hotline for people or communities who have been targeted for hate or who have witnessed hate and need support. So this is not law enforcement. We're not affiliated with law enforcement. We're not going to call the police on your behalf. If you want help filing a police report, absolutely, the trauma-informed care coordinators on the other end of the line can help you do that. This is statewide, so absolutely anybody can use it. It's connected to the 211 network. If folks file online, we have the form in 15 different languages. If they call us up, 200 different languages. And again, this is just for folks who need support. There are a lot of very good and legitimate reasons why folks may not want to invite law enforcement or start a lawsuit, but they need help, but they need support nonetheless. So California versus Hate absolutely is a place for that. You also can get really cool social media graphics and customize your stuff to say Grass Valley or Nevada City is for everyone. We also have a ton of written resources, and this is just an example of the different sort of resources we have. So if you're looking at your screen, we've got a fact sheet. So kind of like gets into the law, gives examples. In the middle there, we have a postcard. Quick and dirty right there. Front is, civil rights of LGBT folks. You turn it over, you got a QR code that takes you straight to other deeper resources on our website. We also have posters. This on the far right is a housing poster that we have, again, representative of the folks that we serve. We do live webinars, which I mentioned. You can check out our website. It's the first 3 Wednesdays of every month. It's at 11 a.m. It's on Zoom. You will see me and my colleague Kara, one or the both of us, at any given time with guest appearances from other folks at CRD. It's open to anyone. We always do one housing session. We always do an employment session, and then we've got a special topic. So like I mentioned in July, we're going to have a special topic on reasonable accommodations. We're going to spend an hour just on reasonable accommodations, just chatting that up. And I will say the reason that we're dedicating a whole hour to that is because we have surveys and folks filled out our surveys and said, we need more of this. So I love feedback, like good, bad, ugly, keep it constructive, but like let us have it because we need it, right? These are for you. They're not for us. We know that not everybody can make it on Wednesdays at 11, so you can check out our YouTube page as well. We have a ton of our training there, and that is it. Thank you folks so much. I know I went a little bit over. Y'all have been wonderful. Thank you in the virtual room. I think we'll log off now, and then we can chat here in the room. Folks in the virtual room, please do get your phone out if you're not already on it. No judgment, no judgment at all. But hit that QR code and take the survey. It'll set you back like 3 minutes, and it will be wildly helpful to me. I want to make sure that this is relevant, that it's timely, that it's helpful. So please, take a moment and let me know what you think and suggest a future topic.